In this lesson, we'll learn how we can render out the final animation of our pod racer sequence. Okay, so at this point now we've completed all the lighting and material setup that we need for this particular scene. So now all that's left to do is actually render out this final animation. So the way that we do this in Max is pretty straightforward. What we first need to do is go into the render setup. So let's go ahead and find this. In my case, it's going to be kind of off here to the side. We'll go into our render setup. Alright, so starting in this Common tab, we have a few options for determining just what is going to be rendered out. Up until this point, we've had our time output set to a single frame, which means every time we render out, by just pressing either this Render Current Frame button, or by just pressing Shift-Q on our keyboard, we've only been rendering out a single frame. Now what we can also do is tell this to render out the active time segment, which will look at our timeline. In our case, the timeline runs from frame 0 to frame 150. Or if we want to, we could actually just specify some kind of a certain frame range. So if we only wanted to render out a couple of frames here and there to maybe just test out our animation, we could do that as well. So in my case, because I want to render out this entire sequence, I'll go ahead and set this to the active time segment. Now we can also choose whether or not we want to view the entire area or render the entire area, or if we want to just render a selected portion of this scene. So in our case, because we actually do want to render out the entire image itself, if we were to take a look at the actual rendered view, we do want to render out this entire view itself. So we'll make sure we have that set. We can also, within this area, determine exactly what the dimension of our rendered image is going to be. So in my case, I'll leave this set to 640 by 480. And a little bit further down, we have our render output. Now this is one of the more important areas because this is actually going to determine where our rendered files are going to wind up. So if we actually want to render this out in some kind of an animated sequence, let's first go over to Files. Alright, and once we do this, it'll take a look at our current project, and then it will specify the folder called Render Output, which should automatically be created for you. So in this area, we can now determine what the actual file name is going to be. So we can call this something like Pod Racer. And from this section, we can now determine what we actually want to render this out. So we could render this out as something like an AVI movie file, or we could actually render out something like a image sequence. Now, typically, even though Max does give you the option to render out in some kind of an AVI file, I would actually recommend not doing this because the way that this AVI file is actually created, the file is actually not usable until the entire sequence has been rendered out. So if you were to render out an AVI, set off your render, and then at some point in time, if Max were to crash or if your computer had a power outage and for whatever reason this file was not able to complete its rendering process, the file would be completely unusable, and that means you'd basically have to start all over again with your rendering. So what I actually prefer to do is to render out in an image sequence. So if we were to render this out in something like a Targa, what this means is it will wind up with one new Targa image for every single frame of our image, or every single frame of our sequence. So what that means is that we will have a lot of files that start to stack up in here. But the benefit of that is that once each frame is rendered out, we get a new image. So if for whatever reason we were to crash or experience a power outage partway through our render, at least we have all the images that have been rendered out to that point. So all we would have to do is reopen our scene and tell the renderer to pick right back up from that point at which it crashed, and then continue moving on, so we don't wind up losing any of our work. Now what we could do is take that Targa image sequence, and then we could run that through our compositing application, something like After Effects, Composite, or maybe even something like Virtual Dub if you needed a free solution. Import that image sequence, and then from there you could render it out from that application in whatever format you want. Just basically taking that Targa image sequence and then converting that to an AVI or whatever you would need at that point. Alright, so go ahead and hit save. It'll ask us, in this case, because I am using a Targa image, whether or not I want to save this as 16, 24, or 32-bit depth. I'll go ahead and save this as a 32-bit. Alright, and once we have that set, that's pretty much all there is to it. So we have the file output set, and we also have our active segments set to render out. So at this point now, all we would have to do is hit render. So we also have the camera selected. We may want to make sure that we are actually rendering this from the proper view. At this point, all we would have to do now is hit render. And now it's going to go through and start to sequentially render out all of these different frames. So it's going to start at frame 0. All right, once that's finished, it's going to move on to frame 1, and so on and so forth until it completes this entire sequence. Now, if for whatever reason we are in the process of rendering this out, we decide at some point that we want to stop the render, maybe we realize that something's wrong at this point, all we would have to do is press the escape key on our keyboard, and that will now stop this rendering process. And now at this point, we can go in, make whatever tweaks, adjustments we would need to, and then re-render. All right, so once this rendering is complete, again, if we were to take a look in the render output directory, here's all of our individual frames, and again, we will wind up with a new image for every single frame. So at this point, like I said, we could open this up in a compositing application, or if you're working on a PC and you need a free solution, Virtual Dub is a good option to use for actually opening up this sequence. So if we were to, again, take something like Virtual Dub or any of these other applications and actually open up this image sequence, we can now view this. And in some situations, again, if we're using something like Virtual Dub, we should now be able to render this out as an AVI, which you can use for any other purposes. So that's a look at our final animation. So once we have our images rendered out, our sequence rendered out, at this point now, that pretty much now brings us to the conclusion of this Introduction to 3ds Max training course. So now that you have a good understanding of a lot of the different areas of 3ds Max, you can now start to focus on some of these more specific areas in some of our other training courses. So from here, we have a number of different courses that you can move into, again, just depending on which skills you want to start to focus in on a little bit more. So we have courses like Introduction to Modeling in 3ds Max, Introduction to Rigging, Introduction to Animation, Introduction to Rendering, or you could go with Introduction to Lighting. So from this point, like I said, you can really start to move into any of these areas and start to explore some of these more advanced topics in a little bit more detail. So I hope you enjoyed the training, and we'll see you next time.